Michael, it's so nice to have you on board today. Michael is at Princeton University, which is in a way full circle because this is where he started out with his bachelor degree in 1989. He then became a graduate student at MIT, and this is actually when our paths crossed because we both were in the same lab, in Richard Anderson's lab at MIT for a couple of years. Michael started his PhD work there, but then I guess the draw to Princeton became too strong, and he returned to Princeton to finish his graduate studies there. He did his PhD, his postdoctoral time, research staff time there, and has now moved through the ranks. And since 2017, he's a full professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. In what sounds like a more or less classical scientific CV, I think we're missing a lot of what Michael and his interests are all about. I read this little description that says Michael Graziano is a scientist, philosopher, writer, and composer, and an occasional ventriloquist. The science will be in the forefront today, but if you realize that Michael has published several books and 5 books on neuroscience, he also went into novel writing with 3 novels that he wrote. And this is hard for anybody to recognize because he's using a pen name, Michael has also published books for children or for young readers under a different pen name. And on top of this, he's been very active in public outreach in the sense of giving talks for a general audience on top of all the science that he's done. If you look at the topics that he's covered, I think there are 2 recurrent themes, and I'm sure both of these themes will play prominently today. One of those themes is social neuroscience. What does it mean to be an organism in a social context? How does it shape our action and perception? And tightly linked to this, the broad question of consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious? How do we study this? And how is our brain enabling consciousness and social interactions? The presentation today is entitled Why Brain Machines Think They're Conscious. So at least one of the 2 topics is already in the title. But I think the aspect of social neuroscience will also play a very big role. So Michael, thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. We're very excited to hear your presentation, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be here virtually talking to you about consciousness. I will plunge right in because I don't want to give a long talk on Zoom. The shorter the better is what I hear. This talk will be mostly conceptual. The study of consciousness is in a conceptual mess and has been for decades. So the most important thing I can do is to lay out some conceptual order. I will get to a small amount of data later in the talk, but first it will take me a while to lay out the pieces systematically to give you a clear logical mechanism that can potentially explain consciousness. I want to start by specifying what part of the problem of consciousness I'll be talking about. It used to be that people thought about the stream of consciousness. I want to make sure my slides are advancing here. We may have our first technical glitch. There we go. Excellent. It used to be that people thought about the stream of consciousness. They would consider thoughts and sensory impressions and emotions and decisions and memories, all the stuff swirling in your head, all of psychology. But most people who study consciousness today have focused on something else. You can make decisions both in and out of conscious experience. You can process sensory information whether it's in or out of conscious experience. You can even process emotions both in and out of conscious experience. All of these psychological processes are orthogonal to consciousness. The crux of the issue is that they sometimes come with an extra essence, subjective experience. People have called it awareness, the hard problem, qualia, the what it feels like part. I sometimes call it experience-ness. For simplicity, let's just call it consciousness or awareness. There are many theories about how it arises from the brain, and I'll tell you about the attention schema theory, or AST, which my lab has been developing for the past 10 years. It's not only a theory about what consciousness is, but also about what specific cognitive functions it serves. Here's the first crucial piece of logic, which is shared between AST and a few other approaches, such as the approach of Dennett or Churchland or Frankish. Everything you think you know about yourself, everything, no matter how certain you are that it's really true, it must stem from information in the brain, or you wouldn't be able to have the thought or make the claim. Everything. The brain is a model builder. The brain's models are bundles of information that describe things in the world. They're both descriptive and predictive, and never trust the brain's models. They're schematic, they're good, but they're not perfect. They're quick and dirty. They're always a bit approximate, a little distorted. They leave out the little details. They have to for efficiency. They evolved that way. This human claim, this insistence, this certainty that we have an essence inside us, the essence of experience, this claim logically must stem from information in the brain. The brain has constructed a part of a self-description, a self-model. And that self-model, like all other models in the brain, is definitely not literally accurate. The intangible conscious experience that you may think you have is definitely not the same as whatever process you actually have. The brain is captive to its own internal models, and those models are never completely accurate. So right away, you see how this approach differs from most other theories of consciousness. For example, integrated information theory says that when information reaches, when you integrate information enough in an obscure mathematical way, then the essence of experience will emerge. The global workspace theory says that when information reaches high enough signal strength to be broadcast around the cortex, then the essence of experience will emerge. And there are other theories. Many of these theories have valid insights, but they're looking in the wrong direction. To make the point, imagine a theory of how white light becomes cleaned of all contaminants and turned into a pure heavenly luminance with no color. Well, you could devise a theory like that. A filter strips away all the ugly particles and only the pure particles are left. But your theory would be wrong because it's explaining a phenomenon that doesn't exist as such. There is a phenomenon. White light is a real thing. One, white is a mixture of all visible colors. Two, the visual system evolved to construct a simplified model of it. In that model, the luminance channel is set high and the color channels are set low. 3, our higher cognition gains at least partial access to the information in that lower level visual model. That's why before Isaac Newton came along, people thought white light was purified, why they were absolutely certain of it, to the point that it was absurd even to question it. And why we still can't help seeing it that way when we look at it. It's because of a simplified model built into the visual system. So let's ask, what causes the essence of conscious experience? The overall shape of the attention schema theory goes like this. 1, there is a real phenomenon. And throughout the talk, I'll discuss what it might be. This is not typical illusionism, as it's called, that says there's nothing there. No, there is something there. 2, the brain builds a simplified schematic model of that phenomenon, a model that is automatic, that is evolutionarily built into us. 3, our higher cognition gains partial access to the information in that lower level model. As a result, our introspection, our intuition is captive to the distortions inherent in the model. That model both informs and, in a sense, misleads us. It contains information useful to the brain, but it also tells us that we have something physically incoherent, something gauzy and mystical inside of us. That's the shape of the theory. I'll fill it in as we go along. It's a theory about what we think we have, what we actually have, and the specific working relationship between them. So why study consciousness? First, it's philosophically interesting. Second, because in AST, this model that the brain constructs is one of the most crucial parts of the cognitive machinery. Without it, we can't function. We can't interact with the world properly. And I'll explain that too as we go along. Just like the brain's model of white light, a good internal model doesn't need to be scientifically accurate. It can mislead us into all kinds of magical nonsense, but it should be pragmatically useful, adaptive. I'll come back to that theme over and over. Here, I'll make the bold claim that AST is the only theory of consciousness that is rational, in that it avoids assuming that our internal models are literally accurate. And therefore, it avoids being stuck in the trap of trying to explain how an incoherent magic comes about. Since William James, more than 100 years ago, psychologists have noticed the close relationship between attention and consciousness, or attention and awareness, as it's usually called in this subpart of the field. There are lots of different kinds of attention and mechanisms at many levels. Let's focus on the cerebral cortex. There's a phenomenon in which signals passing through the cortex compete. Like local elections, some signals win, some lose. The winners gain in strength and affect more of the cortex. Sometimes a set of signals becomes so enhanced that a kind of cascade happens, which is sometimes called ignition. The winning signal dominates brain-wide cortical networks. That whole process, that's what I mean by attention. Some of this sounds like the global workspace theory to those who are aware of it. To me, that theory is really a description of cortical attention, how the cortex selects, enhances, deeply processes. Attention applies to any domain of information in the brain, in the cortex at least. But let's focus for now on vision, which gives us most of our experimental data. Classically, visual attention can be drawn to a stimulus exogenously, such as by a sudden movement, or it can be directed endogenously, such as when a person searches a scene, directing attention from item to item. And often, of course, attention shifts as a result of both processes. AST proposes that the endogenous control of attention is aided by an internal model of attention. The model is a constantly updating set of information that describes and monitors the current state of attention, that predicts how that state may transition into future states, and that predicts consequences of attention on other events like decision-making and memory and action choice. This model of attention, this attention schema, is both descriptive and predictive. It's the brain's simplified but useful picture of attention. In analogy, the motor system controls the arm with the help of an internal model of the arm that both describes the arm and predicts its behavior, a part of what's sometimes called the body schema. Let's put this into more specific framework. Suppose you're looking at an apple and paying attention to it. What can you say about the apple? Well, it's green, it's round, it's right here. This information is built up in a visual sensory model in visual areas of the brain. Higher cognition has access to some of this information, and therefore you can think it, and ultimately you can say it out loud. You might also say, hey, I'm a conscious human. I have a subjective experience of those properties of the apple. My mind has seized possession of the apple, made it vivid. And as a result of a benefit of subjective experience, I'm sure I'll be able to remember the apple for a little while, and I feel able to make decisions about it and react to it. This is what it means to be conscious of something. According to AST, we believe we have these properties based on chunks of information constructed in a low-level automatic model. These chunks of information are some of the more general parts of a model of your attention. The attention schema. Higher cognition, what you think is true, what you claim to be true, is affected by both of these automatic low-level models. Remove this model, and you have a system that can process the visual details and even report them, like a computer hooked to a camera. But there's no basis for the machine to think it has subjective awareness. Logically, it can't make that claim if it doesn't have the information on which the claim is based. And as we'll see later, removing the attention schema may also cripple the machine's ability to maintain attention on the apple. So it probably can't respond to the apple very well either. Remove this model, and you have a system that does think it has subjective awareness, but it doesn't know anything about the apple. So it's not aware of the apple. To be aware of the apple, you need both. Let's suppose for the moment that AST is correct. Awareness is the brain's internal model of attention. What should we predict? Well, prediction 1. Attention should be something physically and objectively measurable with electrodes or MRI, or with behavioral measures like reaction times, because attention is a physical process, whereas subjective awareness should be something we attest to through introspection, because it's the brain's internal information about attention. Well, that dichotomy is certainly true. Prediction 2. Attention and awareness should have similar characteristics. If one is a model of the other, they should resemble each other. And I think this is true too. They both have a focus, more intense on this item than on that. They're both graded. They're not limited to one thing at a time, but are relatively more intense here than there. They both move around, sometimes captured exogenously, sometimes directed endogenously. They both cover the same information domains. You can attend to external sensory items or to internal thoughts. And you can be subjectively aware of the same kinds of items, both external and internal. And they both imply the same consequences. Attending to something means you can understand it, process it, remember it, make decisions about it. Intuitively, we also understand that being subjectively aware of something has the same set of potentialities. In fact, attention and awareness are so similar that I would argue, if you took attention with all its many complexities, its mechanistic details, spatial and object attention, exogenous and endogenous attention, inhibition of return, neuronal competition, if you took all that scientific complexity and you said, I'm just a regular primate in the jungle. I don't care about scientific details. I'm going to create a cartoon sketch of attention that leaves out all the details and captures only the essence of what it's useful for. I think that sketch would be suspiciously similar to the common account of subjective awareness. In its properties, awareness looks like a detail-poor model of attention. So prediction 2 looks like it's correct. Prediction 3, attention and awareness should usually overlap. When you attend to something, you should usually be aware of it. But not always, because the brain's models make mistakes, especially at the noisy threshold of detection. We should be able to dissociate the two, just like we can dissociate the arm from the arm schema. Your arm is in one place and the arm schema says it's in another. Or your arm is amputated and your arm schema says it's still there, a phantom limb. The model doesn't always faithfully reflect the thing it models. And that very close correlation combined with a dissociability is the case with attention and awareness, as we now know from many experiments, including some from my lab. I won't list the literally hundreds of experiments that dissociate attention from awareness. The point is that prediction 3 looks like it's correct. But there's a controversy. Excuse me. There is a controversy because some researchers say, look, attention and awareness are locked together. Inattentional blindness means that when you're not attending to something, you're probably not aware of it. If you're not attending to the gorilla running through the basketball game, you're not even aware of it. Some of you have seen that rather incredible demonstration of inattentional blindness. But other researchers say, no, we can separate attention and awareness. They're independent. Look, here's attention attracted to a stimulus without any awareness of the stimulus. And here's awareness of a stimulus without a whole lot of attention on that stimulus. So which side of the controversy is correct? In AST, the controversy is misguided. Both sides are correct to a degree, but both sides miss the fundamental relationship. Awareness usually tracks attention. That's where inattentional blindness comes from. But there's some slippage at the edges, and the two can dissociate. It turns out you have to work pretty hard in the lab to separate them. They come apart, but not easily, because awareness is an imperfect model of attention. Prediction 4. When you dissociate attention from awareness, the control of attention should be impaired. The brain uses models to monitor, predict, and control. After all, without a model of your arm, it's very hard to control your arm. And now we get to the heart of the theory, the dance between attention and awareness. This is where hard data start to pile up in favor of AST. For example, suppose you're performing a visual task, but there's an annoying fly distracting you, slowing your reaction times. Your attention is divided. The fly is drawing exogenous attention, siphoning attention away from your task. In AST, if you're aware of the fly, it means the system knows that attention has been drawn to the fly. Awareness is the brain's model of attention. And the system can downregulate that attention, shifting your resources back onto the task. But if you're unaware of the fly and it snags some of your attention, then you're in trouble. The system hasn't correctly modeled the fact that attention has been siphoned over to the distractor, and therefore the system can't regulate and reduce attention on the distractor. Paradoxically, if you're not aware of a distractor, it should draw away more of your attention. And this is what happens. Tsushima et al. 2006 found that attention to a distractor is greater when the distractor is masked, such that people are not aware of it. And this is classic control theory, control engineering. You may have some attention on that fly, but to regulate that attention, to strategically reduce it, the system needs to know that your attention is on it. You need a model of that attention, and awareness is acting like that model. Here's another example from my own lab. I told you I'd get to at least a little bit of data. The y-axis is the amount of attention on a visual stimulus, a dot, measured in reaction time cost. Basically, the more intensely you attend to the stimulus, the longer it takes you to respond to a different stimulus somewhere else. And the x-axis is time in milliseconds during the trial. That's a pretty brief description, but I won't go into the methods details. You can ask me later or read our papers. It's the general principles that I want to get across here. When you're aware of the stimulus and when it's task relevant, that's the red line, you can sustain your attention. When it's not task relevant, that's the black line, you still have some attention drawn to the stimulus initially, exogenously attracted to it, and then you can reduce that attention pretty quickly, even suppressing it below baseline, meaning you're paying more attention to other locations than to the stimulus. That's what the negative number means. Something in the brain can control the time course of attention depending on whether the stimulus is task relevant or not. But when you're not aware of the stimulus, when it's masked, so people don't have a subjective experience of seeing it, then that control of attention is impaired. Attention is still drawn to the stimulus initially and then decays. Maybe there's a little more attention when the stimulus is task relevant, but not much. Look at the difference. When you're aware of a distractor, a task irrelevant stimulus, you're able to suppress attention on it. And maybe this is what so-called inhibition of return is, the system keeping attention from lingering too much on a distractor. But when you're unaware of that distractor, you can't suppress attention on it anymore. The inhibition is gone. That result is similar to the Tsushima et al. Finding that I told you about. And when you're aware of a task relevant stimulus, something you ought to attend to, you do indeed pay more attention or more sustained attention. And when you're unaware of it, you pay only transient attention. Basically, when you're aware of something, it's as if your brain is saying, oh, my attention is on it. And the brain can adjust that attention, making it bigger or smaller, sustained or transient, or inhibited below baseline as needed. When you're not aware of something, it's as if your brain has no idea that any attention has been attracted to it. And therefore, the control system doesn't regulate that attention. This is the key relationship. Not that awareness and attention are always locked together, or that they're totally independent either. No, the key relationship is that without awareness, attention is still possible, but the system, lacking a model of what its attention is doing, can no longer properly control that attention. Here's another example from my own lab. I won't go into the methods details. A stimulus, a red dot, appears anywhere on the screen. People are trained without knowing it. Over many trials, their internal control system is conditioned to shift attention from the stimulus to a new location a little bit to one side, 3 degrees to one side, to the empty space there, anticipating a new event. Normally, when the stimulus first appears, it automatically draws some exogenous attention to itself. Again, in these graphs, the y-axis shows a measure of attention at that location. If it's significantly above 0, it means significant attention drawn to that dot. After stimulus onset, people endogenously shift some attention to the new location. And remember, they don't know they're doing it, but they've been conditioned to. Their attention control system is able to shift attention to the new location. All this happens when you're aware of the stimulus. When you're unaware of the stimulus, about the same amount of exogenous attention is still drawn to it. But the control system can no longer shift attention significantly to the new location. Why? Well, it's the same story. If you don't know that your attention has been pulled to the dot, then you can't make that relative adjustment, shifting attention correctly to the new location. It's like trying to shift your arm a specific controlled amount without knowing where it is at the moment. You can do a lot without awareness, a surprising amount. You can process information, you can respond to stimuli, you can even attend to stimuli. But in study after study now, without awareness, the control of attention is impaired, the kind of control that requires knowing what attention is doing in order to adjust it. That's what we think the data show. Awareness is acting like a model of attention. Awareness tells the brain what its attention is doing, so the brain can control that attention. Prediction 4, which is the most central prediction of AST, is turning out to be correct. Now for prediction 5. So far, I've suggested that people construct a model of their own attention. The model is physically incoherent because it leads to the belief that we have a magic essence of experience inside us. But it's still incredibly useful. Without it, the attention controller doesn't work right. We proposed that people not only model their own attention, but during social interaction, they also model the attention states of other people based on observed cues like where the person is looking and body posture and what the person is saying. And our models of other people's attention should be just as magical and physically incoherent as our models of our own attention. We've done a lot of work on this, but I want to focus on one type of experiment. Very strange, very remarkable phenomenon. When you look at a picture of a person, it turns out that intuitively, without knowing you're doing it, you can't help seeing that person as having a subtle beam of mental energy emanating out of his head. The motion processing parts of your brain rev up. We know that. We've put people in MRI scanners. We've done what's called multivoxel pattern analysis, and we've seen the motion processing parts of the brain, cortical area MT, revving up in a directionally specific way, as though processing motion flowing out of people's heads. Again, I'll skip the details of the many experiments here. I want to emphasize the underlying ideas. You can read about the details in our papers. When you see a person staring at an object, when you look at this for even just 1.5 seconds, you develop a subtle motion after effect in the space between the face and the object, as though you've been looking at visual flow from the head to the object. And we can measure that motion after effect by taking away this picture and popping up a field of randomly moving dots. We ask people to report which direction the field is drifting, and their motion judgments are biased as if they have a motion after effect. If you put a blindfold on the face or turn the head around, that motion of after effect does not occur. Unless you tell people that the guy here is attending intensely to the object, and then the motion after effect returns. We implicitly perceive attention, visual or otherwise, as motion streaming from the head. If we put up 2 heads, we can manipulate people's perceptions of who is attending to the object by adding a subtle subthreshold actual motion flow to the background of the picture. People don't explicitly detect the motion, but it tickles their motion machinery and adds to their model of someone else's attention. The brain is using the motion processing system to help model who is attending to what. I think that's evolution being opportunistic. I think we've evolved to draw subtle moving arrows on the world around us to more quickly keep track of who is attending to what. We can't help it. And it's just sub-threshold enough that we don't usually know we're doing it. It's like a football commentator drawing arrows on the screen to clarify the action. Our brains draw moving arrows on people. The signal is strong enough to usefully influence our social judgments. But at the same time, this fictitious motion signal is not so strong that it interferes with normal motion perception of real objects. In our interpretation, that's why it's sub-threshold. But it gives you a hint of how the brain's models are not literally accurate. Sometimes they're bizarrely inaccurate, physically incoherent, but they can still serve a useful purpose. In this case, more efficient social perception. And you can see how these natural inborn models bubbling up into our higher cognition might result in a cultural mythology about mental auras that are otherworldly, the energy essence of consciousness, the internal magic. So where is this model of attention computed in the brain? Probably in a network of areas. One area that seems to play a large role is the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ. I'll touch on it only briefly here. This area is known to be involved in social cognition and theory of mind, so it makes sense that it might be involved in modeling the attention states of others or of oneself. The TPJ is also classically involved in the control of attention, and damage to it on the right side can lead to the most severe cases of hemispatial neglect, a loss of attention and awareness on the opposite side of space. Here's an experiment of ours showing the cortical areas that are more active when people are aware of a visual stimulus versus when they're not aware of the same stimulus. The two conditions experimentally balanced in as many ways as we could manage. Therefore, in our hands, this is at least some of the activity related to awareness. We don't think this cortical area, the TPJ, is processing the visual stimulus. We think it's modeling attention and thereby constructing the concept of awareness. Here's what happens when you ask people to judge whether someone else is aware of something, building a model of someone else's attention. This social cognition processing is a little more posterior in the TPJ, which is consistent with many studies. And there are other MRI studies from our lab and others that speak to this question of anatomical location. But I don't want to go into any more detail. The cortical mapping is interesting, but it's not central to the theory. Whether the information is handled in this or that part of the brain is less crucial than the fundamental theory. We model our own attention, which is useful for controlling our own attention. And we model the attention of other people, which is useful for interacting with other people. And those models, as useful as they are, also give us distorted, semi-magical notions of subjective experience and mind essences. That's the theory. To summarize, most theories of consciousness are wrong. Almost all theories of consciousness start by assuming that the brain's self-models are literally correct. They assume that what we find introspectively about ourselves is literally real. They assume the presence of mental magic, and then they attempt to explain the conditions under which that magic arises. An enormous amount of effort has gone into that endeavor. But you might as well assume that visual models constructed in the brain are literally accurate, and then try to explain how white light gets all the color contaminants removed from it. The fundamental assumptions are wrong. In AST, we are machines that believe, insist, have an absolute conviction about ourselves. And we have those convictions based on information constructed in deeper models. In AST, we construct models of our own attention and models of the attention of other people. These models, being imperfect and detail poor, give us distorted, magicalist notions of subjective experience. And those models have a specific adaptive utility. They evolved for a reason. The model of one's own attention helps to control one's own attention. The model of other people's attention helps in social cognition, in understanding and predicting the behavior of others. And I hate to admit it, but we're trying to build these things artificially. We have a neural network project in the works. If you can build it, you can understand it. But we're a long way from a computer that thinks it's conscious in the same way that we think we are. And with that, I will stop. Thank you all very much.